So I'm going to add a MySQL database to my Kubernetes microservice, which is built using Java Springboot. I'll do this in 3 stages. In the first stage, in the development environment, I'm going to install MySQL locally and test the database connection there. In the second stage, I'll install my microservice into Kubernetes and get it to talk to the same MySQL server, which is installed on my local machine. And in the third stage, we'll install a MySQL service into Kubernetes. So to get the local version of MySQL, I'm going to go to mysql.com and go to the bottom and install MySQL Workbench. Once that's installed, we should have a front end that looks like this with a list of databases. Now I've already got it installed, so I've already got some databases in there, but I'm going to create a new database, which is create schema, and I'm going to call it MSHW, which is microservice hello world, the name of my microservice, and just accept the default options. And there I've created MSHW database. Now to add MySQL support to my microservice, I'm going to go Spring add starters, and I'm going to add starter for Spring Data JPA and a MySQL driver, and then copy over the POM changes so that Maven brings in the dependencies needed to support MySQL persistence. Then I'm going to define an object that we're going to persist in the database. So I'll make a new package, call it model, and I'll create a new class, and I'll just call this simple record. I'll annotate that as an entity, so that's something we want to store in the database, and I'm just going to give it a simple ID primary key. That will just be a generated value, and that is the ID there, annotating it as a primary key or the identification field. And then I'll just have a string contents, so I'm just going to have a primary key and a single string in this object. There's a constructor taking in the string in the constructor, and I'm just going to add getter and setter methods. Generate getters and setters, select all, and I'll add a constructor, an empty field constructor. And I'll save that, and that'll be our object that we're going to save into the database. And I'll make a new package called repository. And this is going to contain our class that actually saves things into the database and loads them. In this, I'll just make an interface simple record repository. And that is going to look like this. So it extends CRUD repository, which is a Springboot repository. And Springboot will implement this class for us. I'm just going to redefine find all to return a list of simple records. So I'm keeping it very simple. This CRUD repository contains classes for delete by ID, delete, count, find all, find by ID, save. So we don't have to implement those methods. They'll be automatically implemented by Springboot. And then in my service layer, I'm going to create a DB service. So this is an interface. I'm just going to define the methods that we want to use in my application. I'm just going to have an add record, which takes the string that we want to put into the simple record before persisting it, and a get records that just gives us a list of simple records. And my implementation of DB service, looks like this. I'm going to annotate it as a service. So this has an auto-wired simple record repository, and then the methods that we defined in the interface implemented. So add record is going to create a new simple record with the string provided as a parameter to the method there, and then save the record in the simple record repository. And get records is just going to return the list of simple records. And then in my controller, I've got my hello world controller. I'm just going to make a separate controller now and call it db controller. Annotate it as a REST controller. And I'm going to have two methods in here. Read, which will call the service get records and return all the simple records. And write, where we provide as a parameter in the path the string that we want to write into a new simple record to persist into the database. Then the only other thing I need to do to get this working in my development environment is in application properties. I need to specify data source properties. So this is my SQL localhost, runs on 3306, and the database that I created, MSHW. Then the username and password, just root and password. And then JPA properties, we want to use MySQL 8 dialect and show SQL, so that will output SQL to the console. This is just standard stuff that I always use. We may want to change that later, but for now that will do. So in the DB controller, I have two methods, one mapped to /read, and that's going to call the service get records and return all the simple records, and one mapped to /write with the parameter content in the path, and that's just going to call DB service add record with the content that we provide. Okay, so now I'm going to run my application up, and I'm going to pull up a web browser and navigate to localhost 8085, which is where we're running, and then read, and we can see read returns nothing. If I do write test string, there is our simple record ID1 automatically assigned and contents test string, and now if I do read, we get test string back. If I look in my database now, refresh it, we can see we have the simple record table, and if I do a select on that, test string is saved into MySQL. So we've added MySQL to our microservice application. Now for the next step, I'm going to install the application into Kubernetes and get it to talk to this database. But to make sure the database can be reached, I need to go into server users and privileges. We're using the root user, and I need to make sure this wildcard is set in limit to host matching. The default option in MySQL is to only accept options from localhost, but now we're going to make a connection from a Kubernetes host, so I need to make sure we can connect there. So in my application prod properties, I'm going to define the data source as this, so it's the same as before, but now we're using the IP address of this local machine. So really I've just redefined the server in our production environment, which is what we run in Kubernetes, to have a different database connection. Everything else is the same. Now I'll do maven install to rebuild the jar. When that's finished, I'll just have a look inside the target folder to make sure the jar's been rebuilt. It has, so I'll rebuild the Docker image. So just make sure I'm in the right place there, and Docker build. The MSHW image. And do Docker images just to confirm that it was created 12 seconds ago. Now I'll delete my previous deployment, so kubectl delete deployment, mshw deployment in the namespace mshw namespace, and then reapply my YAML. So I had to delete the deployment because Kubernetes wouldn't have realized the Docker image has been rebuilt, but that has redeployed the deployment there. Now I can pull up a web browser, and ingress is pointing to mshw.com/read, and we get the test string /write and another string, and then if we do read, we've got another string. So now we're running in Kubernetes, but we're still pointing to the same MySQL database, and if I select on it, we can see we've added another string there. So it's very simple to get Kubernetes to talk to MySQL on another server. That may be a preferable option, but option 2 is we install MySQL into Kubernetes and talk to it as a volume in Kubernetes. So let's have a look at that now. So when we're installing MySQL in Kubernetes, we need to install the deployment, we need to install services. I think it uses a stateful set instead of a replica set to install the deployments, and that's because of the way MySQL works, and you have one node for writing and then you have worker nodes. But the deployment is more complicated than just installing a YAML file. So a simple way of installing things is using Helm. Now we're going to look at Helm later, but if you imagine the way we install our application, we have to build the Docker image and then we have to install from the YAML. Now a pre-made package like MySQL, we'd have to build images of the MySQL deployment, and then we'd have to install services from the YAML, and Helm makes this very simple. So we can install Helm by going to helm.sh and following the instructions here to get it installed. Now I downloaded the binary version, and that just comes as a straight executable, so I've put it somewhere and added its location to my path. So Helm works for me in the terminal. If we do Helm list, we can see what we've installed with Helm. So at the minute I've got nothing installed with Helm. So we're going to use Helm to install MySQL. Now there is a website called artifacthub.io. If we go to that, we can find Helm charts to install. Now I'm going to put MySQL in there, and the first one that comes up is Bitnami MySQL. I'll click on there, and if we find too long didn't read, it tells us how to install the chart with Helm. Okay, so I'm going to take the instructions from the too long didn't read section to install MySQL with Helm and run it there. And that's going to download the image that we need and install all the services that we need for MySQL. And we have some instructions here. So these instructions, I'm going to save them because we will need them later. So if I look now, I could do Helm list, and I can see that we've installed a MySQL chart called MyRelease. If I do kubectl get all, we can see it's installed a MySQL pod and services for MySQL and a stateful set. And we can also do kubectl get pvc, and we can see we've got a MySQL persistent volume claim, and pv, we have a MySQL persistent volume defined there as host path. So now if we go back to the instructions, so it gives us our primary service name. That's the name of the MySQL service in Kubernetes, and we want to use that in our application prod properties. We want to point our Spring data source to that. We're still going to use MSHW database name, which I still need to add. Then back to the instructions, we get the root password with this command here. So I'll just grab that. That's going to set it as MySQL root password. So I'll run that in the terminal and then echo MySQL root password. There's our root password there, so I'm going to copy that and put that as a Spring data source .password and save that. Back to the instructions, it says we run a pod that we can use as a client, and that's the command we need to run for that. So I'll just copy that. So this is going to download a image of a MySQL client, and then we're going to run it. We're setting the environment variable MySQL root password in that client as it is that we've just copied here where we are now, and we're going to run an interactive terminal bash in that client. So we're creating a pod and then going inside it. So now we're inside MySQL client. Back to the instructions, we run this command, and because we have that environment variable set, we can use the password there. And this is the name of our service in Kubernetes. So we're really running a MySQL client for that server, MySQL server. So now we're in MySQL. I can do show databases, and we have just a standard MySQL database. So now I can do create database, MSHW, and then show databases again. And now we have an MSHW database. Now I'm going to keep this client open, so I'm going to open a new terminal and just cd to the right place. And now I'm going to rebuild everything. So I'm going to do a run as maven install to rebuild the jar of my microservice. And once that's built, I'll go to my terminal and rebuild my Docker image. Docker build tmshw. Make sure that rebuilt 4 seconds ago, so it did. Now I'll delete my deployment again. Delete deployment. MSHW deployment in the namespace MSHW namespace, and I've reapplied my YAML kubectl apply f. So now we've recreated the deployment, and it now should be configured to use a MySQL inside Kubernetes. So now I'm going to visit mshw.com, read, we've got nothing, write, and I'll say record inside Kubernetes. And then if we read, I've just written read, so now we have two records, one record inside Kubernetes and two read. And now if I go back to my client, I could do show databases. We have MSHW, so use MSHW. Show tables. We have simple record and select star from simple record, and there are our records. So now we're using MySQL as a persistent volume inside Kubernetes. But that's how to use MySQL in Kubernetes, both as an external MySQL database and as one installed in Kubernetes. So thanks for watching.